There's a moment in every empath's journey when they realize that their greatest weakness can become their most devastating weapon. Not through cruelty or manipulation, but through something far more terrifying to those who prey on emotional vulnerability. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the master of human psychology, understood this transformation better than perhaps any writer who ever lived. He knew that when an empath learns to embrace solitude, they discover something that narcissists spend their entire lives running from: the ability to face the truth about human nature without flinching. Dostoevsky wrote, "The soul is healed by being with children and by being with nature." But he also understood that before the soul can be healed, it must first be willing to examine its wounds in the stark light of solitude. And when an empath does this work, when they stop running from their own pain and start learning from it, they develop what Dostoevsky called the terrible gift of seeing people as they truly are. This sight, this unflinching perception of reality, becomes a power so devastating to narcissists that they will do anything to avoid being truly seen by someone who has mastered it. Today, I want you to understand why Dostoevsky believed that the empath who learns to be alone with their own suffering becomes the one person a narcissist can never fully deceive, manipulate, or control. This isn't about becoming cynical or hardened. It's about developing what Dostoevsky called conscious suffering, the ability to transform pain into wisdom and vulnerability into unshakable strength. And before we explore how Dostoevsky's insights can help empaths discover their hidden power through solitude, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I want to know, have you noticed how your ability to see through people's facades changed after spending time alone with your own truth? Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. The first thing Dostoevsky understood about empaths is that they typically start their journey as what he called the underground man, someone who feels everything deeply but has no framework for understanding or protecting themselves from the intensity of human emotion. You absorb other people's pain because you think it's your job to heal everyone. You excuse toxic behavior because you can feel the suffering behind it. You sacrifice your own well-being because you believe that's what compassion requires. But Dostoevsky knew that this kind of unconscious empathy isn't actually compassionate. It's what he called sentimental foolishness. True compassion, he discovered, requires what he termed the courage of discrimination, the ability to see the difference between someone who is genuinely suffering and seeking to grow, and someone who is using their pain as a weapon to manipulate others. In solitude, away from the immediate pressure to respond to everyone's emotional needs, empaths begin to develop this crucial discrimination. You start to notice patterns you missed when you were constantly reacting to crisis after crisis. You begin to see the difference between someone who takes responsibility for their behavior and someone who just makes excuses. You learn to distinguish between authentic remorse and performative apology. Dostoevsky called this process the education of the heart through suffering. In solitude, you're forced to confront your own patterns of enabling, your own addiction to being needed, your own fear of abandonment that makes you tolerate unacceptable behavior. This confrontation is painful, but it's also liberating because it reveals the unconscious motivations that made you vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. Number 1, you develop what Dostoevsky called the inner eye. In his novels, Dostoevsky's most psychologically powerful characters are those who can see into the souls of others not through supernatural ability, but through having faced their own darkness honestly. In solitude, empaths learn to turn this same penetrating gaze inward first, examining their own motivations, self-deceptions, and hidden agendas with ruthless honesty. This inner work creates what Dostoevsky called moral clarity, the ability to recognize truth from falsehood not just in others, but in yourself. When you've spent time alone confronting your own capacity for self-deception, you become almost impossible to deceive. You can sense when someone is lying not because you're psychic, but because you know what lying feels like from the inside. Narcissists depend on people who haven't done this inner work, people who are still deceiving themselves about their own motivations and therefore can't clearly see through others' deceptions. But when they encounter an empath who has developed the inner eye, who has learned to see themselves clearly through conscious solitude, they find themselves facing someone who can't be fooled by their carefully constructed facades. This inner eye becomes particularly devastating to narcissists because it allows you to see the profound emptiness behind their grandiose presentations. Dostoevsky understood that narcissists are essentially people who are running from their own inner void, their own sense of worthlessness, their own fear of being seen as they truly are. They create elaborate personas and manipulative strategies to avoid this confrontation with their authentic self. But the empath who has learned to sit alone with their own darkness, who has faced their own sense of inadequacy and transformed it into self-acceptance, can see right through these defensive structures. You recognize the desperation behind the arrogance, the terror behind the control, the emptiness behind the grandiosity. And this recognition, this ability to see their true nature, is absolutely terrifying to them. Write in the comments now, "I see clearly." Say it like you're declaring your commitment to truth over comfortable illusions. Number 2, you develop what Dostoevsky called conscious compassion. Most empaths start with what he would call unconscious compassion, automatically feeling sorry for everyone who appears to be suffering without questioning whether that suffering is being used manipulatively. In Solitude, you learn to distinguish between suffering that leads to growth and suffering that's being weaponized to control others. Dostoevsky wrote extensively about characters who use their pain as a justification for hurting others, who turn their suffering into a form of moral manipulation. He understood that not all pain is noble, that not all suffering leads to wisdom, that some people use their wounds as weapons rather than as opportunities for growth. This recognition, this ability to see when suffering is being performed rather than genuinely experienced, becomes crucial for empaths who want to maintain their compassion without being exploited. In Solitude, you learn to ask the hard questions about the people in your life. Is this person using their pain to grow and become more loving, or are they using it to justify treating others badly? Are they taking responsibility for their healing, or are they expecting others to carry that burden? Are they learning from their mistakes, or are they just collecting sympathy for repeating the same destructive patterns? This conscious compassion is terrifying to narcissists because it means you won't automatically excuse their behavior just because they can produce a sob story. You understand the difference between explaining someone's behavior and excusing it. You can feel compassion for their pain while still maintaining boundaries around their actions. You refuse to let their suffering become your responsibility to fix. Dostoevsky called this love with eyes wide open, the ability to care about someone while seeing them clearly, to offer support without enabling dysfunction, to maintain empathy without sacrificing your own well-being. This kind of love is absolutely devastating to narcissistic manipulation because it can't be guilted, shamed, or manipulated into accepting unacceptable behavior. Number 3, you discover what Dostoevsky called the strength of those who have suffered consciously. In his novels, the characters who emerge strongest are not those who avoided pain, but those who faced it with awareness and used it as a catalyst for inner transformation. In Solitude, empaths learn to transform their sensitivity from a vulnerability into a source of profound strength. Dostoevsky understood that conscious suffering, pain that's experienced with awareness rather than avoided or numbed, creates a kind of psychological resilience that can't be shaken by external circumstances. When you've sat alone with your deepest fears, your most painful memories, your most uncomfortable truths about yourself. You develop what he called inner fortitude, a strength that comes from having survived the encounter with your own darkness. This strength is particularly threatening to narcissists because it means you're no longer afraid of their emotional manipulation tactics. They try to trigger your insecurities, and you don't react because you've already faced those insecurities in solitude. They try to create drama and chaos, and you remain calm because you've learned to find peace within yourself, regardless of external circumstances. They try to threaten abandonment, and you don't panic because you've discovered that you can be genuinely happy in your own company. Dostoevsky wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." But he also understood that this inevitable suffering, when embraced consciously, becomes the foundation for a kind of wisdom and strength that can't be acquired any other way. The empath who has learned this lesson becomes someone who simply can't be broken by the psychological games that narcissists rely on. Hit like if you're ready to transform your suffering into strength, and subscribe if you want more insights into Dostoevsky's psychology of conscious transformation. Number 4, you develop what Dostoevsky called moral courage. In many of his novels, the most admirable characters are those who are willing to stand alone for their principles, even when it costs them socially or emotionally. In Solitude, empaths learn to develop their own moral compass, independent of others' approval or disapproval. You discover what you actually believe, what you actually value, what you actually consider acceptable behavior, separate from your need to maintain relationships or avoid conflict. This moral courage becomes devastating to narcissists because their manipulation often depends on your unwillingness to stand firm in your convictions when it might upset them. They count on your desire to keep the peace, your fear of being seen as difficult, your need to be liked overriding your need to be respected. But when you've spent time in solitude clarifying your own values and developing the courage to live by them regardless of others' reactions, their emotional manipulation loses its power. Dostoevsky understood that true morality isn't about following rules imposed by others. It's about developing such clear inner guidance that you can distinguish right from wrong even in complex situations. The empath who has done this inner work in solitude becomes someone who can say no to requests that violate their values, who can call out unacceptable behavior even when it's socially awkward, who can maintain their integrity even when it costs them relationships. This moral courage is terrifying to narcissists because it means they can't use your desire to be seen as good, kind, or understanding to manipulate you into accepting their bad behavior. You're willing to be seen as difficult if necessary to maintain your integrity. You're willing to upset them if that's what it takes to respect yourself. You're willing to end relationships that require you to compromise your fundamental values. Number 5, you learn what Dostoevsky called the terrible beauty of truth. In his exploration of human psychology, Dostoevsky discovered that truth, while often painful, has a power that lies simply cannot match. In Solitude, empaths learn to value truth over comfort, reality over pleasant illusions, authentic connection over superficial harmony. This commitment to truth becomes a force that narcissists simply cannot overcome. Narcissists survive by creating alternative realities, by gaslighting their victims into doubting their own perceptions, by constructing elaborate lies about their motivations and behaviors. But when they encounter an empath who has learned to value truth above all else, who has developed the courage to see and speak reality, even when it's uncomfortable, their entire manipulation system collapses. The empath who has mastered solitude refuses to participate in the narcissist's fantasy world. You won't pretend their lies are truth. You won't accept their rewriting of history. You won't play along with their victim narratives when you know they're actually the aggressor. You insist on dealing with reality as it is, not as they wish it were or as they're trying to convince you it is. Dostoevsky called this the courage of acknowledgement, the willingness to see and name what's actually happening rather than what you wish were happening or what others are trying to convince you is happening. This courage, this commitment to truth, is perhaps the most powerful weapon an empath can develop against narcissistic manipulation. Write in the comments, "I choose truth over comfort." Say it like you're making a sacred commitment to reality over illusion. But here's where Dostoevsky's insight becomes truly revolutionary. He understood that this transformation, this development of inner strength through conscious solitude, doesn't make empaths less compassionate. It makes them more effectively compassionate. When you're no longer vulnerable to manipulation, when you can see people clearly without being deceived by their performances, when you have the strength to maintain boundaries while still caring, you can actually help people in ways that unconscious empathy never could. The empath who hasn't done the inner work often enables dysfunction in the name of compassion, accidentally reinforcing destructive patterns by refusing to let people face the consequences of their actions. But the empath who has developed conscious compassion through solitude can offer what Dostoevsky called tough love, caring that includes accountability, support that doesn't enable dysfunction, empathy that doesn't sacrifice truth. This kind of conscious compassion is actually more threatening to narcissists than outright rejection because it offers them something they desperately need but are terrified to accept: the opportunity to be seen clearly and loved anyway, but only if they're willing to be honest about who they are and committed to genuine change. Most narcissists would rather be rejected than face this kind of authentic love because it requires them to give up their false self and confront their real issues. Dostoevsky understood that the people who are most afraid of being truly seen are often the ones who most desperately need authentic connection. But they can only receive that connection if they're willing to drop their masks and manipulation tactics. The empath who has mastered solitude can offer this possibility, but they can't force someone to accept it. And this is where the real power emerges. The empath who has learned to be alone with their own truth becomes someone who can offer authentic love without desperately needing it to be accepted. You can extend genuine compassion without being devastated if it's rejected. You can see people's potential for growth without needing them to fulfill that potential for your own sense of worth. This freedom, this ability to love without attachment to outcome, is perhaps the most terrifying thing of all to narcissists because it means they have nothing to hold over you. They can't threaten to withdraw their love because you don't depend on it for your self-worth. They can't create crises to get your attention because you won't sacrifice your peace for their drama. They can't manipulate your empathy because you've learned to offer it consciously rather than compulsively. Dostoevsky called this the liberation of the heart, the freedom that comes when you've learned to love from wholeness rather than neediness, from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion. This liberation doesn't make you less loving. It makes your love more powerful because it's offered freely rather than extracted through manipulation. The narcissist looks at this kind of conscious love and sees their worst nightmare. Someone who can see them clearly, who isn't afraid of their emotional tactics, who won't enable their dysfunction, but who is still capable of genuine care if they're willing to be authentic. This represents everything they want, but are too terrified to pursue: real connection based on truth rather than performance. But perhaps most importantly, Dostoevsky understood that this transformation serves a larger purpose. The empath who has learned to love consciously through the mastery of solitude becomes what he called a beacon of truth in a world full of deception and manipulation. Your very existence becomes a challenge to others to examine their own authenticity, to question their own motivations, to consider whether they're living from truth or from fear. You become living proof that it's possible to be sensitive without being naive, compassionate without being foolish, loving without being exploited. You show others that empathy can be a source of strength rather than vulnerability when it's guided by wisdom rather than compulsion. So if you're an empath who has been struggling with manipulative people, if you've been wondering how to maintain your caring nature while protecting yourself from those who would exploit it, if you've been looking for a way to transform your sensitivity into a source of power rather than vulnerability, Dostoevsky would tell you that the answer lies in solitude, not the solitude of escape, but the solitude of confrontation. Not running from your pain, but learning from it. Not avoiding your darkness, but integrating it. Learn to sit alone with your own truth until you're no longer afraid of anyone else's lies. Develop the inner strength to see people clearly without being devastated by what you see. Cultivate the moral courage to maintain your values, even when it costs you relationships. Transform your suffering into wisdom and your vulnerability into conscious compassion. When you do this work, when you learn what Dostoevsky called the art of conscious living, you don't just protect yourself from narcissistic manipulation, you become someone who can offer authentic healing to those who are genuinely ready to receive it. You become a force for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable lies, a source of real love in a culture of superficial connection. Write in the comments now, I transform my pain into power. Moi. Say it like you're making a commitment to use your suffering as a catalyst for wisdom rather than a reason for bitterness. This is Dostoevsky's great gift to sensitive souls everywhere. The understanding that your deepest wounds can become your greatest strengths, that your most painful experiences can become your most powerful teachers, that your capacity to suffer consciously can become your ability to love wisely. The empath who learns these lessons in solitude becomes not just immune to narcissistic manipulation, but a beacon of hope for anyone seeking authentic connection in an often deceptive world. If this message resonates with you, if you're ready to transform your empathic nature from a vulnerability into a conscious power through the wisdom of solitude, then you've found your community. Subscribe to join others who understand that the greatest strength comes not from avoiding pain, but from learning to suffer consciously, not from closing your heart, but from opening it wisely. Because when empaths learn the power that narcissists fear most, the power of conscious truth, moral courage, and wise compassion, they don't just change their own lives, they become catalysts for authentic transformation in everyone they encounter. They become living proof that sensitivity guided by wisdom is the most powerful force for good in the world.